This video is a refutation of an abuse of Matthew 18, people's wrong interpretation of how to deal with others' sin, the sin that they see other people committing, and what should happen when you see another person commit a sin. People like to abuse Matthew 18, use it wrongly to state that if you're addressing someone else's sin or calling out someone else's sin, you have to go to that person before you do anything else. You have to go to that. We're talking about believers here. When you go to correct sin in a believer, it is said by these people that you have to go to that believer first and address it with them privately before you go public with it. And this is not the biblical model. This is not what we see Paul teaching when he gives an example of what he did in the book of Galatians in chapter 2. So we have to interpret Scripture with Scripture. So Matthew 18 has to be interpreted by Galatians chapter 2. I'm going to read Matthew 18, and then I'll read Galatians chapter 2. So the Matthew 18 passage that I'm referring to here says, "If your brother sins against you, go and tell him his fault between you and him alone." And what's important here is that some manuscripts just say, "if your brother sins," and it doesn't include the words, "if your brother sins against you." But it's an important distinction that there are manuscripts that do say, "if your brother sins against you." So that's an important thing to remember. "If your brother sins against you, go and tell him his fault between you and him alone. If he listens to you, you have gained your brother. But if he does not listen, take one or two others along with you, that every charge may be established by the evidence of 2 or 3 witnesses. If he refuses to listen to them, tell it to the church. And if he refuses to listen even to the church, let him be to you as a Gentile and a tax collector." So there we have the passage that people like to cite to say you got to go to a believer privately first before you publicly call out their sin. But when we go to Galatians chapter 2, we have an example that helps us interpret Matthew 18, and we can see that Matthew 18 is specifically about a sin that's committed against you and not just any sin. And because we see Paul publicly rebuke Peter for a sin that's not specifically against Paul, but it's just a sin that's actually leading people astray, and because it's leading others astray, it needs to be publicly rebuked so that people see it for what it is and they don't become led astray by it any longer. So I'm going to read Galatians chapter 2, starting in verse 11. "But when Cephas," that's Peter, when Cephas came to Antioch, I opposed him to his face because he stood condemned. For before certain men came from James, he was eating with the Gentiles. But when they came, he drew back and separated himself, fearing the circumcision party. And the rest of the Jews acted hypocritically along with him, so that even Barnabas was led astray by their hypocrisy. But when I saw that their conduct was not in step with the truth of the gospel," what does it say he did when he saw this? "I said to Cephas before them all, 'If you, though a Jew, live like a Gentile and not like a Jew, how can you force the Gentiles to live like Jews?'" So look at that. It says, "But when I saw that their conduct was not in step with the truth of the gospel," so I see my brother sinning. Does it say, "I went privately to Peter and took him aside privately before I said anything to anybody else"? No. It says, "I said to Cephas before them all, 'If you, though a Jew, live like a Gentile and not like a Jew, how can you force the Gentiles to live like Jews?'" He called out Peter's hypocrisy in front of everybody so that people wouldn't be led astray by it. He saw that Barnabas was led astray by this. So what can we learn from this? We can learn that when you see a fellow believer acting in a sinful way that can lead other people astray, you don't have to go to that believer privately first. You can actually just publicly rebuke that believer if you have 2 or 3 witnesses who can confirm what you're saying. And we see in 1 Timothy chapter 5 the need for a charge against an elder to be established by 2 to 3 witnesses. 2 or 3 witnesses are needed. You need to have those witnesses in order to admit a charge against an elder. Let's read 1 Timothy, and this isn't just for elders. In 2 Corinthians chapter 13, it's just a blanket statement from Paul that you need the witnesses, the two or three witnesses for any charge. It's not just for elders. It's just when you're saying that somebody's sinning. And so it's good to make sure that you know that other people have witnessed the sin and can testify to the sin that you're talking about before you publicly rebuke somebody for sin. You need to be able to back up what you're saying. And Paul could have done that. He could have showed the people there, well, here's how Peter's sinning. You're my witnesses now. Here, you're all a witness to what Peter's done. I'm calling it out right now, and I have the witnesses who see this. Here it is. And so Paul did have witnesses to what was going on. It was happening right in front of everybody, and he called it out. We see in 1 Timothy chapter 5, it says, "Do not admit a charge against an elder except on the evidence of 2 or 3 witnesses. As for those who persist in sin, rebuke them in the presence of all, so that the rest may stand in fear." So when you have those witnesses, you can, and you should, rebuke elders who continue to persist in sin, and you should do that in front of everyone. This is what the Bible clearly says. And we see from Galatians that you don't have to go to the elder beforehand, privately. If they sin against you personally, you should do that. But if it's just a sin that can lead other people astray, that's not specifically against you, you should call it out publicly if you have the 2 or 3 witnesses to back up your claim. And so we cannot tolerate the wrong understanding of Scripture concerning Matthew 18. Don't let people say, well, you shouldn't have publicly called out that guy if you hadn't gone to him first about this sin. Well, actually, yeah, you should, if you have the witnesses, publicly call out elders or other people who are leading others astray, so that people are not led astray by sin. And you don't have to go to people first in private, as Paul demonstrates. He gives us this story. This is not just something descriptive that was written down in the book of Acts or something to just tell us what happened. This is Paul recounting what he did as an example for us in the book of Galatians. Paul is not giving us an example to follow that's sinful here. He's giving us a good example for what we should do, which is to publicly rebuke people who are leading others astray, and we don't have to go to them in private first, because Paul did not go to Peter in private first before he publicly rebuked him. And we have to take all of Scripture into account when we're interpreting Matthew 18. We can't just take one piece of Scripture and not see what all the manuscripts say and just look at one version that just says if your brother sins. We have to see, oh, well, there's actually manuscripts that say if your brother sins against you. And then we need to look at Galatians and put those together and realize if your brother sins against you, that's when you go to them privately first. So that's what I have. Let's follow the Bible and not human opinions.